if there is no God, don't tell me that I have to live by values that protect the other from my exercise of freedom. And don't tell me that I have to care about the poor and their condition. Because if there's no God, there's no meaning to anything.
Father John, good to have you on one more time.
Good to be with you, Paul. I'm enjoying our discussions of this topic.
Yeah, I feel really privileged that I get to chat and compare ideas with you before we even do these things. And so I'm just learning a lot from that. And we're just going over it lightly. So really looking forward to diving in again. It's going to be our second talk on a subject that I think both of us find really exciting. And you happen to know a lot more than I do. But Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and how these two men really came to the fore, I guess, at a really crucial time
Hmm.
at our society's development, our civilization's development. And it's really, really valuable. It's been incredibly valuable for me to understand better what's happening there.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah, sure. So let quickly, last time we spoke about basically the situation that Western society was arriving at as we're coming to the end of the 1800s. And the main thing is that we are seeing the foundational beliefs of Christianity and Christendom were collapsing. God had changed from the age of paradise to like being everywhere present and filling all things to more and more kind of being replaced by a utopian version of the world instead of like the age of paradise. And now increasingly going to a kind of state where you have a deism, where God is kind of either, totally, too far away to actually have an influence on anything, so irrelevant in deism, or even just plain atheism, where, God doesn't even exist. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so we're going to focus on Nietzsche today and his influence. And what I wanted to start with was how would you describe Nietzsche's perception of the problem that we're arriving at? And then after that, we're going to go into his proposed solution.
Yeah, okay, good, Paul. Well, yeah, let's take up Nietzsche now. So last time we talked about kind of the history of what I call Christendom, a civilization with a supporting culture that directs its people, its members toward the transformation of the world. In the first millennium in the West and in the East, that transformation was heavenly. Heaven came into this world and transformed the world through the liturgical life of the church, sacramentally, because of the incarnation. God was not remote from this world. We'll talk about deism, I think, in just a moment. As you just pointed out, for deists in modern times, God is too remote to be part of this world. But because of the incarnation, traditional Christianity, certainly Orthodox Christianity, I'm an Orthodox Christian, believed that the whole world now has come into contact with heaven, and the church, living out her sacramental life, brought heaven into the world. And you can see this in the architecture, the iconography. You can even see it in the transformation of marriage and relations between husband and wife. You can see it in the actions of the Christian state with Christian statecraft in that first millennium. But things changed radically in the West, not in the East. In the East, this continues after the first millennium. But in the West, because of the rise of Roman Catholicism after the Great Schism, dated about 1054, 11th century, things change radically. And they change radically in that they more and more set barriers between heaven and earth in the piety of what most people call the Middle Ages, a term I don't use, and I don't think it's an effective, useful term to use any longer. By the time of the Renaissance, there's a rebellion, reaction against that barrier, against the inability to see the cosmos or world transformed, and the reaction takes the form of secularization, especially in what's called humanism, placing man at the center of everything rather than the God man, Jesus Christ, who's both God but also man. Now it's really just man, man in a cosmos that is spiritually untransformed. And that's the origin of what you called a moment ago utopia, as I understand it. And now utopia redirects all of that transformational energy away from the deification or sanctification of the of people in the world toward just the world itself on its own terms without any reference to God. The best example of this in its earliest forms probably is the deism you just spoke of, when during the so-called Enlightenment, another problematic historical term that I don't use, um, people like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or in this country, Thomas Jefferson, all rejected Christianity and its claim that God became human in Jesus Christ and the human condition has been transformed as a result. They rejected that and they said, man's only real purpose is to, as Voltaire put it, cultivate our garden to make the world a better place. And this really is the origin of what we call progressivism, the idea that progress is the proper, rightful mentality, ideology to have in an increasingly post-Christian Christendom, a Christendom that's still
Would you
driven.
say that it's also the like where just ideology in general kind of comes in and replaces religion then? Like ideologies are the tools perhaps that are used for this transformation in the secular vision of what humans should be doing.
Yeah, I think ideology comes to replace Christianity in Christendom in this post-Christian period. Ideology being, a counterfeit of Christianity. Ideology seeing that the world needs to be transformed. The world as it exists right now, the cosmos as it in its existing order, is unacceptable, imperfect, and in need of some kind of transformation. This is a uniquely Christian thing. No other civilization has ever introduced what I call the transformation imperative. But Christianity, Christendom, that is to say, the world needs to be changed. In
Mhm.
that first millennium, it needed to be changed by being filled with the sacramental life of the worshiping church, with all
Mhm.
the effects that had on architecture, statecraft, and so on. In a post-Christian civilization, such as post-Christian Christendom of the kind of post-Renaissance West, what happens is now the world gets transformed in a unspiritual way without any reference to a transcendent source of that transformation. It's no longer the incarnation of God through Jesus Christ by the Holy Spirit. It's now man coming up with ways of understanding on his own terms and for the sake of this world itself that transformational kind of experience. And so, yeah, you might say that ideology has its birth in the collapse or loss of influence of Christianity in the West.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, the 18th century put forward this idea that God, there is a God. Yeah, there's a God. Of course, there's a God. These people I just mentioned during that so-called Enlightenment, I mentioned them. There's a God, but he has nothing to do with this world after he creates it. He just lets man transform the world himself for his own needs. And that's the kind of the new mythos, the new mythological kind of conviction of Christendom in its post-Christian Western modern form is that man really the goal of life is to be progressive, to transform the world in a way that brings progress about. And so the 19th century, after the French Revolution kind of blew things up, the 19th century was all about like finding the right ideology to make that happen. And in my book series Age of Utopia, I talk about the three dominant ideologies of liberalism, nationalism, and socialism that all in their own way tried to do this. And we could talk about what those are. But to get to Nietzsche in the 19th century,
Maybe before you go there, can I just ask you to say a little bit more about that transformational imperative that you mentioned? Because it's really clear how that's something that seems to go through and be still in place, even. And that's what's driving this whole progressive drive with everything from evolution to transhumanism,
yeah.
and like, so where does that come from? And why is that unique to Christendom, even?
Yeah, we're very unsettled in the West, especially now that we no longer have a transcendent source for this transformation imperative that Christianity introduced as far back as Pentecost. From day one of the history of the church, Christendom had a transformation imperative that said this world in its broken, fallen, kind of benighted condition is not what all there is. That God has become part of that through Jesus Christ, through the incarnation. And in the life of the church, the new man, right? Not the old Adam, but the new Adam, Jesus Christ, that Paul talks about this in Romans, is now the model for humanity, that there's a new humanity that will
Mhm,
spring out of baptism and a life in Christ because of the initiative from heaven of God to become incarnate in Jesus Christ.
mhm,
So there's this really dynamic, transformational, powerful, vigorous kind of imperative, right? To see man transformed, and by man, of course, I mean male and female, mankind,
mhm,
both of whom completely, not only completely bear within the two sexes, and there are only two according to traditional Christianity,
mhm,
both bear the image and likeness of God equally. But furthermore, as Paul says in twice in the New Testament, there is no longer male or female in Christ Jesus. Oh yeah, there's male and female. Paul even acknowledges that there are two sexes, but both participate fully on an equal level of sanctity in the
mhm,
sacramental life of the church. And so, unlike, say in Judaism, where only the male part of humanity was circumcised and therefore fully initiated into the life of the church, so women now, along with men, are equal in their baptismal transformation. And so, this new humanity then, it transforms the world and introduces this thing I call the transformation imperative. And the world is never the same in Christendom. The world is never the same once this is introduced into civilization, and it begins transforming the world in the West. As we could talk about the whole history of that, but we don't want to. But by the time we get to secularization, the Renaissance, the collapse of confidence because of the Roman Catholic piety of the so-called Middle Ages, which emphasized the degradation of man, the hopeless, kind of almost hopeless condition of human beings in this world. I mean, the famous, I talk a lot about it. It's really easy to introduce, and just as a kind of example, the famous, almost bestseller of that period by a pope, one of the most important, Innocent III, who wrote a book called On Contempt for the World, The Misery of the Human Condition. That's the title of the book, The Misery of the Human Condition. I mean, that is so different than that first millennium joyful transformational experience through repentance, a joy creating repentance of life in the church. And that out of that springs a reaction called secular humanism that now
mhm.
looks to the world and not to Christianity, because since the Great Schism of the 11th century, Christianity in the West has become largely pessimistic about the human condition and negative about life in this world. And so that's really important for understanding Nietzsche. That's really important.
So let's jump to him now. And so the yeah, what we're heading towards is how he then perceived this problem. And I'll talk a little bit about why I myself was attracted to Nietzsche a bit later on as well, because I actually found this a very honest way of looking at things if you take
Yeah,
his foundationalist understanding of the world into account.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so as I understand Nietzsche in its historical context, and I want to emphasize this, I think we cannot and should not try to engage thinkers outside of their context historically. That is to say, we need to understand the historical circumstances that led a given thinker like Nietzsche to arrive at the conclusions he arrived at. We really need to do that. There's no way of a Nietzsche of the 11th century, the first millennium. There's no way for a Nietzsche of the Renaissance. That would be incomprehensible. There could be no Nietzsche in the so-called Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment. Nietzsche had to be someone who dwelt in the middle 19th century, when utopian expectations of this secular transformation of the world were reaching their limits, and their problems, the problems of this progressive ideology or concept of civilization, was reaching its limitations and was beginning to show signs of being a failure, the failure that I believe it is. And so, as a counterfeit of traditional Christianity, it took the place of Christianity after the Renaissance and after the so-called Enlightenment, this utopian or humanistic mentality. It more and more claimed that not only is God distant from this world, but in fact, it claimed there is no God whatsoever. Atheism now replaces deism. Again, deism is a belief in a God, but a God that has nothing to do with this world, does not perform miracles, did not become human to share the suffering of the human race with humanity and redeem that suffering. This God for the deists is a God that can't be believed. Only for the deists, God created everything and then just kind of let it go. But by the 19th century now, instead of deism, it's atheism. Deism didn't really convince anyone but a small circle of intellectuals for a 50 to 100 year period of time, and then it just had, it kind of reached its persuasiveness in the culture and collapsed. So by the 19th century, you've got actual outright atheism taking its place. This atheism claimed, deism is more than problematic and needs to be abandoned, but Christianity is even more problematic and long ago was abandoned for good reason. And therefore, we're left with a belief that there is no God whatsoever, that there is only the human condition in this world, this natural secular world. And this was very empowering, as deism had been, because it means that man's left in charge to resolve the problems of progress for himself. And so there was a slew of 19th century intellectuals and philosophers who, as atheists, began to explore how do we sustain progress? How do we sustain the transformation imperative in a world without a God, a cosmos with no transcendent point of reference? But these philosophers and intellectuals largely carried with them a lot of the presuppositions and instincts of Christendom. That's why we still need to call it Christendom, even if it's post-Christian Christendom, because a lot of the convictions are still there. And some of these people were, some of the philosophers of that time still purported to be Christians, but they were going well beyond any conventional understanding of Christianity. Immanuel Kant, early in the 19th century, is a good example of that. Hegel is another good example of that. There were people like John Stuart Mill in England who was an outright atheist, and realizing that if there's no God, what does that mean for ethics, for human behavior and interrelationships and social boundaries and bonds and things like this? And so John Stuart Mill developed an atheistic philosophy of ethics called utilitarianism, where he tried to lay out on the principle or basis that there is no God, why people are bound together in social relations that mean something, that have some productive, progressive kind of value to them. He was a liberal. There were socialists who were also atheists, most famously Karl Marx. He also, as an atheist, built into his understanding of history and progress a belief that there is no God, that there's only the infrastructure. God, religion is a part of a superstructure that's invented to sustain or perpetuate a economically oppressive social order. But at the infrastructural level of society, the material level, that's where things really happen, and there's no God, and so eventually religion will just disappear, and people will be driven only by economic instincts and economic needs in the future communist, utopia. Both of these philosophers, these atheistic philosophers, are utopian totally through and through. They totally believe in this idea that progress is inevitable and we've just got to work to make progress better. There are many other examples I could share with you about these atheists in the culture of the 19th century. That Friedrich Nietzsche, now to introduce him, was an atheist is no surprise. People should not think, "Oh, Nietzsche, atheist. Wow, that's a turning point." It's not a turning point. The turning point was 50 or more years earlier. What's what's a turning point about Nietzsche is that he saw through in kind of like he had eyes to see, as it were. He had eyes to see that these were counterfeits. Um, Utilitarianism, Marxism were counterfeits of traditional Christianity, that they had emerged in a Christian civilization, Christendom, as counterfeits or replacements of traditional Christianity. And now that they were serving a progressive role rather than a salvific deifying role as they had in the first millennium, now they're serving a secular progressive role in society. And that they are really rooted in Christianity itself and Christianity's ancient values. In the
And
case of
morals.
John, go ahead.
Sorry, and morals. I just said like
Yeah.
it's often you talk to atheists, and I think the most frustrating thing they hear from Christians is they get told, "Oh, you're actually acting like a Christian anyway, right?" And they get frustrated because they just can't see it. And that was the same case with me in my years as an atheist. I People told me that get quite offended by it, right? But it's
Hmm.
actually the truth that the reason why Nietzsche made such an impact is because he could see how people just had grown up with these foundational assumptions that were born out of Christianity, and they were just going along with that, just taking away God instead. And I guess
Yeah.
that's what Nietzsche's insight
Yeah,
was.
right on. I mean, that's it. And so he looked at, like, let's just use the two examples I gave: liberal utilitarianism and socialist Marxism. Both of them bear within them values, morality that's not totally, irreconcilable with Christianity. I mean, with utilitarianism, the principle Mill introduced is, you have total freedom to believe and do whatever you want until it starts to impede on the freedom of the other. So this is like the golden rule: is treat others, as you would like them to treat you, and things like this. So it's about the other, in some sense, and protecting the other from the potential violence or harm that the individual can do to the other around him. In the case of Marx, of course, it hardly needs to be pointed out that Christianity, as so many world religions, valued very highly the condition and the needs of the poor and the oppressed. And
Which is not a priority for the Romans or anything like that, right? Before,
yeah,
before, like that changed really with Christianity.
it did change. You're right. I mean, it would raise the hair on the heads of atheists today, even nihilistic atheists, I think, in many cases, to be offered the alternative to what Christianity gave, to return to, say, pagan Rome, where people are putting their infants to death after they're born because they're the wrong sex, or all the other abominations that are occurring in ancient Rome.
Mhm.
And so, and the poor, as you just mentioned, that slavery is legitimate and should be,
Mhm.
the slave owner should just be free to do whatever he's going to do, wants to do to his slaves. So
Mhm.
Marx was, reacting to the oppression of a capitalist society and the wealth disparities and the suffering of the industrial working class, what he called the proletariat, in places, cities of mid 19th century Europe. But again, so back to Nietzsche, and we don't want to talk too much about utopian thinkers. Nietzsche is not that. He rejects utopianism. He rejects humanism. He says that this is all crypto Christianity. This is crypto Christianity. Don't tell me you're an atheist, John Stuart Mill. Don't tell me you're an atheist, Karl Marx. He didn't study Marx very closely, but don't tell me you're an atheist, because all you're doing is you're propagating Christian values. And those values somehow come down to what Nietzsche considered to be the principle or virtue of mercy, of love, of unconditional sacrificial love for the other, which of course hardly needs to be pointed out is the central value or virtue of Christianity, is to love the other, love your neighbor as yourself, after loving God with all your being. And so Nietzsche saw this and he considered it to be crypto Christianity. And so he radically rejected all of these ideologies and philosophies that were atheistic. Again, his atheism is not new. The fact that he's an atheist is not new. But what he did now was he took atheism to what you might say is its logical conclusion. And
Mhm.
that is, if there is no God, don't tell me that I have to live by values that protect the other from my exercise of freedom. And don't tell me that I have to care about the poor.
At the end of this month and every single month going forward, we're going to be running something called a Genesis workshop, which is going to be an opportunity for you to go back to first principles and to formulate some daily habits that you'd like to be doing in your life to get a fresh start. If that sounds like something you'd like to sign up for, it costs 17 euros, that's about 20 US dollars, then we have spaces available. Check out the link in the description below. Thanks.
And their condition. Because if there's no God, there's no meaning to anything. This is Nietzsche's most, this is the turning point. This is the radical thing that Nietzsche said. If there truly is no God, then nothing, nihil, matters. And this is the origin of nihilism, the belief that nothing matters. And as Nietzsche famously put it, poetically, because he loved to write in a poetic kind of provocative way rather than the treatise where you have chapters and sections and it's all scientifically laid out in that kind of enlightenment way. Nietzsche loved to just hit you in the face with his assertions. And he said, in this case, God is dead. God is dead. There is no God. And furthermore, we have killed the very possibility of believing in God. Now, what he meant by that was not, of course, literally, but what he meant was our society, our culture, our post-Christian Christendom of the 19th century has reached a point where it's no longer possible to believe in anything that's transcendent, whether it be the interests of the working class or the interests of the other individual in society next to you. There's no possibility of believing progress is even possible because progress is stifling. And all that's left, if there's no God, if God truly is dead, as he put it in his famous way, if God is dead, then man is left to with nothing that makes life meaningful. The only thing that can make life meaningful for Nietzsche, and he would argue he was not, sometimes he would argue he's not really a nihilist because of this principle, but it's pretty nihilistic. He said, all that exists is the will to power, the will to dominate, which itself is a meaningless force that just courses through all existence, certainly all life, all animal life. Nietzsche was, in a sense, a materialist in the sense that he thought there's nothing more than the measurable material world, though he rejected outright, the scientific materialism of, people like, the scientists of his day. But he said that all there is this elemental, instinctual will to power. And if God is dead and there's no validity or value to anything that transcends this world, given by God, as people have been more and more saying, then all that's left to do is to live for that will to power, to let it take over your being. And here you have the collapse of liberalism with its emphasis on the individual making rational decisions for the improvement of his or her life and organizing a good, solid social order in which many individuals will be able to kind of progress upward in society and have good, healthy lives, careers open to them. And Nietzsche said, this is all nonsense. This is all nonsense. And I could read a couple of quotes to you if you're interested that bring out some of these beliefs. The one thing that Nietzsche said is that Christianity stands in the way of this. And so he identified Christianity as the great the great boogeyman of history. The great I mean that makes it sound kind of silly, but Christianity is the worst thing that ever befell human civilization for Nietzsche. Because back to the Roman Empire, before Christianity arose, the will to power was in full force. The slave owner would treat his slave girls, the way he wanted to, and no one would challenge him. He would exploit and kill and execute even some of his slaves if he wanted to. And for Nietzsche, this is the will to power. It's and having it completely unrestrained makes for a healthy civilization or culture. And to suppress it is to undermine culture. And so Christianity, with its ethic to love one's neighbor as oneself, to feel pity for the suffering, to sacrifice oneself for the other, as Christian marriage had always called on the husband and wife to sacrifice each other for the sake of the other's salvation, to bring Christ to each other. Ephesians chapter 5. I speak of a great mystery, and that is Christ and his church when he says, wives, obey your husbands, and husbands, love your wives as yourselves. This for Nietzsche was all a terrible um, um, uh, uh, fall from a healthy culture. Christianity ruined the cosmos, and so he spent all of his time fighting against Christianity and Christianity's influence. And by the end of his life, I mean, he really kind of assumed not only maniacal but a monomaniacal kind of form. I mean, he was just obsessed with Christianity's, in his opinion, detrimental effect on civilization, and tried his best to become what he called himself, the Antichrist, the one who is instead of Christ.
Yeah.
But I've been talking a lot, Paul, and I know you have a lot of thoughts about Nietzsche too, and I don't want to I want to like let
Well,
you speak
I want to
and
ask you one more question because reading your book about Nietzsche, it's all the four books here I have there. Actually, this is all the Saint Paisios books I have there, the green ones, and those are yours there. But I really enjoyed the kind of interplay between Wagner and Nietzsche as well in some of his work. So maybe you could just give a little bit about Wagner, who he was, his background, and a little bit about the relationship between their thinking between those two men.
I'd love to. I love classical music. I listen to nothing but classical music. I do it all the time. So I'm always listening to what's called classical music. That's kind of um, a problematic term, specifically 19th century romantic music.
Mhm.
I love 18th century classical music in the form of Mozart too, or Haydn or whoever, but and some Baroque in the form of Bach and Vivaldi. But anyway, classical music is usually understood to be, like orchestral or operatic music that reached its high point in the 19th century, and certainly did. Well, during that time, Richard Wagner, who was a German, died in 1883. Wagner emerged as kind of the bad boy of classical music in that he was himself nihilistic in his attitude toward the received heritage of Western music in its classical forms, stretching back to the Renaissance and Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. Wagner took as an artist, and we don't want to get into this, but the modern art beginning with the Renaissance is all about edging out, elbowing out your predecessors and drawing all attention to yourself as being the revolutionary who's going to change everything. And that's
Mhm.
certainly the history of modern art. But
And the
Wagner,
natural result of wanting to replace God with man, and then there's the artist who's replacing now you could call it the celebrant or the Christian priestly role.
Mhm.
Of course, there's no
Yeah,
God to put
yeah.
the attention onto, so now the attention needs to be on me. I really liked also your description of how just like the thing of signing your name underneath your artwork came in as well in a very interesting place. Yeah, but I don't. Let's
Yeah,
leave that.
Michelangelo and the Pietà, it's still, I think, still in the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, revolutionizes the artwork as the work of a genius who signs his name on it, rather than something liturgical that's anonymous. The artist is supposed to be invisible, and you're supposed to see Jesus or one of his saints like the Virgin Mary and pray. It's a liturgical work, and now it becomes a very secular work, totally in line of what we've been talking about. Anyway, by the 19th century, Wagner in this tradition is very radical, revolutionary. I mean, he actually participated in the mid-century revolutions of 1848, 1849, and had to go into exile because he was on the barricades, and finally, when the revolutions failed, he had to flee Dresden, Saxony, where he lived and where he had been a musician, and spent a lot of his remaining years in exile until finally he was allowed back into Germany. Well, Wagner was a revolutionary. He had contempt for the given order of the cultural order of Europe, let's say mid 19th century. Now, someone like me looks back on the 19th century and I just think wow, to be alive then and to hear the latest, Wagner opera to come out or read the latest novel by Dostoevsky or whatever it might be, like, wow, what a time to live. But for people at that time, certainly for Wagner, everything was corrupt, everything was in decline, it was disintegrating, it was unacceptable, it had to be redeemed somehow. And so his redemption was to introduce into music and culture, and he was all about culture broadly, not just music. He talked about his music as being the total work of art, which would draw in all forms of culture. What he wanted to do was offer a kind of a mythological um, alternative to what he considered to be the scientific, rationalistic, Enlightenment kind of civilization of his time. And so his operas, especially his most famous operas that are contained within a series of operas, a four-part series of operas called The Ring of the Nibelung, his operas used Nordic myth and Germanic myth. He was a German nationalist, among other things, and they used a kind of a non-Christian, even pre-Christian mythography to excite his contemporaries to abandon the Christian tradition that still kind of, inhabited the culture of the 19th century, even if it was increasingly secular, even atheistic culture. And so, in the case of the Ring of the Nibelung, which features actual gods and goddesses of the Norse legends, the Ring of the Nibelung puts forward an image of a modern man who overthrows God, who completely destroys, breaks the power of God, so that he, modern man, can rule instinctually for himself. Now, this is all being done in the 1850s and such, when Nietzsche is just emerging as, becoming intellectually aware of the world around him. He latches on to Wagner, becomes a disciple of Richard Wagner, visits him, writes kind of supportive literature for him, promotes him, and largely, like so many people did, almost worshipped him because he was just such a genius, Wagner was, and such a like vigorous, exciting presentation of this new nihilistic culture. And in the case of the Ring of the Nibelung, there's, I think, a particularly important scene that kind of shaped Nietzsche's way of thinking. And it's found especially in the opera from that series called Siegfried, and it features a hero for Wagner called Siegfried, who's afraid of nothing. He fears nothing. He's a nihilist. He's a nihilist. He fears nothing. Um, and his origins are in an incestuous relationship between a brother and a sister that are half gods, and so Wagner kind of passes us off as like, not my fault. It's just part of the Norse legends and that kind of thing. So he's the offspring of incest, which is itself, of course, a very morally nihilistic act. He has no real training or learning that he depends on a mentor or someone else. Wagner was largely self-taught, which is part of the reason why he was so revolutionary, is because he just blew up the existing musical kind of tonal system that existed by the mid-19th century. He was an autodidact, which was a romantic kind of virtue. Think of Dr. Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel, teaching himself how to reanimate life. It's all self-taught, the autodidact of this period, the genius, the individual genius. So Siegfried's like this, and he has a broken sword. And people who've, your audience who've been through the famous and wonderful series of movies on Tolkien's Ring, will recognize so many of these themes, because Wagner, long before there was a Tolkien, Wagner was putting this forward in the high art of the 19th century. And there's a broken sword that Siegfried needs to reassemble, and his mentor named Mima can't do it, so Siegfried elbows him out of the way and does it himself in a famous scene in Siegfried at the end of Act One, with wonderful music playing. Oh, it's just so exhilarating. This music is playing as he's working the bellows, and he's saying, he's singing about putting Nothung, his sword, back together, and he finally does it. And then he goes off with his sword to fight a dragon named Fafnir and kill him, take his money, including the powerful ring that was kept there in his hoard, and then go on in the final act to confront the king of the gods with his sword in hand. Now, that king of the gods is known as Wotan. He's a version of Odin in the Norse legends. Wotan. Wotan in the opera holds a spear, a symbol of power and punishment and authority, on which are written in runes all the moral laws by which man must live. all the moral laws, all the morality, the transcendent morality of the human race, right? This is all kind of a an allegory of Christianity and its belief in a transcendent God who gives us our morals to live by, something that John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx had tried to replace atheistically. So Wotan's walking around with this powerful sword. At the end of the previous opera, he actually raises a sword in the air and says, "Whoever fears the tip of my spear will never cross through the fire that I've set around my daughter, whose name is Brunhilde, to await a man to come and win her as his own, as his bride." And so he's standing there by this ring of fire. Um, and Siegfried shows up in the final act of Siegfried, the eponymous opera, with his sword that he's forged himself. It's not called No Tongue for what that's worth. He has a name for it, and
Mhm.
he's confronted by Wotan, who puts his sword out in front of him, and he says, basically, none shall pass. You cannot pass because I am here to stop you. And Siegfried says, in his very nihilistic way, who are you to stop me? I mean, putting words in his mouth. You might be king of the gods. You might be an allegory of the Christian God that Christendom has lived under the authority of for so many centuries, even in its atheistic forms, like atheistic moralities like Mill and utilitarianism, Marxism. But I don't care. So get out of my way. And he takes his sword and he swings and he smashes. He cuts in half the spear on which all that morality is written, that transcendent morality is written. And Wotan looks down, looks at Siegfried, and says, "Go ahead. I can't stop you anymore." And Siegfried passes by him, goes through the magic fire, wins Brunhilde as his bride in this wonderful, incredibly unforgettable, musically beautiful end to that opera. And so it's a celebration of modern man, essentially just destroying the transcendent authority of God,
Mhm.
even in its atheistic forms. This Nietzsche latched onto. Nietzsche thought of himself as Siegfried.
Mhm.
And so he watched this in its rehearsals. He was invited to come watch the rehearsals in Bayreuth in Bavaria in Germany. He really identified with Siegfried, as he put it once in one of his books. Siegfried. What's great about Siegfried is he stabs anyone who gets in his way. He just kills everyone who kind of gets in his way, whether it be, well, whoever. And so this is the artistic musical inspiration for Nietzsche's development of a philosophy of nihilism.
Mhm.
And we can see it in this in the doctrine of the Superman, the Übermensch, which Siegfried finally, I'm sorry, Siegfried, I'm confusing them.
Mhm.
Nietzsche finally lands on in his more mature later writings.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll kind of stop there, Paul. Let you kind of
Yeah,
say
I
a
think
word because
Father
I'm
John, I
again
mean, this
talking
it's
too
been
much.
fascinating. So I haven't wanted to at all break off or interrupt. It's been really interesting, but I think we're going to have to. We still want to talk a little bit about how Nietzsche's ideas played out in his own life, and you have some extra details that are really interesting. I think we might get to them when we talk about Dostoevsky, and then also we're going to talk about like how I think as what do you call it? Father Seraphim Rose actually called Nietzsche the prophet of the modern age of nihilism. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I think we're going to have to save it for another conversation because we've used up our time here. We're hitting the hour in 4 minutes. So before we start another
Mhm.
question, I think we'll say thanks very much, Father John. That was really fascinating. I really enjoyed even more detail than your book. So that was great.
Okay, good. Well, I encourage your listeners to go out and somewhere on the internet find some of these musical works. They really are wonderful,
Yeah.
beautiful, but they're very secular and they are in fact in Wagner's case nihilistic, and they really show us where the culture is going. So yes, if we're to continue this next time, Paul, maybe what we want to do is then pick up on where Nietzsche was looking at a civilization with a supporting culture that no longer directed its members toward the heavenly transformation of the world, and which could no longer really effectively and convincingly direct its members toward the secular transformation of the world. And perhaps now we see the end of that transformation imperative with a conviction that nothing matters. And if there's to be any transformation, it can't be progressive. It can't bring anything good about. It's just going to be nihilistic. and we'll look, maybe we'll have a chance to see how Nietzsche articulated this in his philosophy.
Absolutely. Yeah, when you're left just with each individual person and their own wants and desires and will to power,
Yeah.
or whatever it is, will to something or other, I guess. But thank you very much, Father John. I'll just take the last opportunity here also to mention that once a month, every month, we're running something called a Genesis workshop. And the idea behind the Genesis workshop is really that I've realized I've grown up in a culture that's saturated and marinated in a lot of these ideas of progressivism and like an absence of God really, and so we're trying to run this workshop just to help people in a very small way to get on a different path. And look at those foundational assumptions, and we're looking at just in the simple roles of like the roles that a man has in his life, as far as being a son, a brother, a husband, and a father is concerned. And then giving people one simple habit that can kind of get them going on that new path. So I'll put the link for that in the description below. And I can also just recommend here, check out Father John's books. I really enjoyed them. If you enjoyed this conversation, then they're really incredibly informative as well of getting a clear idea of how we got where we are today. And that's a good way of figuring out how to go forward after that. So thanks, John. Anything else you want to, Father John, do you want to add anything else before we
No,
finish up?
no, I really, it's nice talking to you about this stuff. I love it, and I hope your
Yeah.
audience
I
enjoys
think every conversation
thinking
you did, I
about
see
it.
your eyes shining even more from every conversation.
Uh-huh.
So,
Wait till we get to Dostoevsky. Yeah,
looking forward to it. Okay,
yeah.
thanks so much, Father John.